So, this is going to be shorter, I think. I hope. Okay, so the second half is called Years of Fulfillment. And the focus is on Mary Foster's work here. And there was a lot. There was a lot. It wasn't that she was focused out just on South and Southeast Asia. She really did a lot here, and people just don't know that. So we begin. All right. We begin with her relationship. I was over at the palace. This is Queen Liliuokalani, and as I said earlier, Liliuokalani and Mary Foster were good friends from childhood. So James Robinson had a tremendous respect for and friendship with John Young, and Queen Emma was John Young's granddaughter, and so they became good family friends. And because James Robinson was born in England, he was part of the Anglican church. And so the missionaries were from the Congregational Church, which is a different sort of form of Christianity. And so he took his children to the Saint, what's the one down Andrew's Cathedral, to church. But for him, he wasn't a religious man; he was a spiritual man. He took his family more for the congregation, for the community, for the Sangha, as we say in Buddhism. And he wanted his children to have, friends from all different groups. And so they were together at that church. So Mary Foster and the Queen maintained their friendship, throughout their lives. So I was over at the palace. A good friend of mine from Kyoto just came to visit. She's my closest friend in Japan. And part of her bucket list was to see Niagara Falls. So I went with her to see Niagara Falls last week. So anyway, before we went, we had a few days here, and she wanted to see the palace. So we went to the palace, and I've been there lots of times, but we went upstairs to the Queen's room, and there was the quilt. And there in the corner of the quilt is the embroidered name, Mary. Now, I'm sure it's Mary Foster. I'm sure it's Mary Foster. Because she never mentions any other Marys that she knows in her book. I mean, she may know lots of Marys, but I'm sure it's Mary Foster. Mary Foster and Victoria Ward were two people who were allowed in the palace after the overthrow. And they went to visit her a long time, and Kevin loves this story. She was not allowed to read newspapers. So what Mary Foster did was she wrapped flowers in newspapers and brought the flowers and the newspapers into the palace and gave them to the Queen so that she could read the newspapers. They were very, very close, very close. And she talks about Victoria Ward and Mary Foster in her book, and about how important they were to her as friends, and how they really helped in the resistance against the overthrow. So this is an older picture of the Queen. So when the overthrow occurred, everybody, of course, not everybody, but Mary Foster and her family were quite devastated because they kept thinking that there was going to be a compromise. They kept thinking that there was a chance. She had written letters to President Cleveland, and she had met him in 1888 when she had gone to D.C., Queen Liliuokalani, and he really found her to be just an extraordinary woman, of very kind of esteemed grace, is the way he described her. And recently, his grandson was here, and they're trying to revive this kind of relationship between President Cleveland and Liliuokalani, because he really fought to try to stop the overthrow. And then he was defeated. And then another president came in who was totally for the annexation. And the whole socio-political context changed because there were wars out in the Pacific, and they felt that Hawaii was going to be a strategic position. But it was much more because of the greed of the sugar barons, if you will, that they really opposed the stopping of the overthrow. Cleveland sent a man named Blunt, B-L-O-U-N-T, to come and to see what was going on and how this could have happened. And Blunt, who actually was a Southern Republican, wrote this very sympathetic report saying that it was in fact illegal, for them to overthrow the monarchy. But that report was ignored, and when the new president came in, it was McKinley, and he was much more interested in furthering the sort of international scope of Hawaii and of the United States, and so he allowed the annexation to take place. So it's a very sad thing. So this grandson who came and was trying to reestablish these ties, he looks just like his grandfather. I mean, if he had that kind of little mustache that hangs down, he would look exactly like him, but he looks so much like him. It's incredible. So Mary Foster got involved in the resistance. And not only did she offer funding for it, but she actually helped in gathering the names on the petition. And you can find both her name and her sister's name. You don't find her brother Mark Robinson's name, which is very odd, because he had been in Queen Liliuokalani's cabinet. But I think he was tortured because he owned sugar plantations out in Waiua. And so he was torn because he thought that the annexation would be important for sugar, for expanding the horizons, of the people of Hawaii, and allowing for more money to flow in. So he actually became a member of the provisional government, which was, opposed to the royalists, and were intending to create a democracy here. And then again, as I said earlier, he decided to leave that because he saw the way that they were thinking about, Hawaii and the Hawaiian people, and he was part Native Hawaiian himself, and he couldn't reconcile that. So, so Mary Foster, I thought she went with Liliuokalani when Liliuokalani was allowed to leave the palace because she wanted to go see family in Boston. So they let her out of her prison, her upstairs bedroom prison at the palace, and allowed her to go to Boston. Well, when she was in Boston, she then took a train and went up to Washington, over to Washington. And I had this feeling that Mary Foster joined her. But again, my good friend David Forbes tells me, no, she didn't. I was like, okay, you say so. So it's quite interesting. I have to tell you a funny one. Barbie came up after the talk and she was saying that she remembers, she went to McKinley High School, and she remembers the swimming pool was elevated and you could see over into the property of the Ward estate. So then I asked her, did you ever go through the fence? And she said, she's Kolohe, so I know she did. So I thought it was pretty funny. Anyway, so Mary Foster was again so distressed about what was going on, and she got to know some of the Japanese businessmen in town, and so they understood her interest, in spirituality, and particularly in Buddhism. And so she became very much involved. They came to her and asked her, and I think it was probably Saiji Kimura, the Hilo businessman who took care of a lot of the things for the Buddhist community in town. And I think that he must have known her family because he did a lot of work inter-island, so he would be coming back and forth between Hilo and Oahu. And I'm pretty sure that he knew her father. And he knew how generous Mary Foster was. And so the businessmen came to her and asked her if she would be willing to support the building of the first Buddhist temple. And she said yes, she would. And it was built on Fort Street, and it was supposed to open around the beginning of 1900. However, there was a big fire in Chinatown, if you remember your history, because of the plague. And somehow there was a mistake when some of the firemen were trying to contain the fire got out of control, and the whole Chinatown area was demolished. And so she helped in the relief efforts on that as well. And a lot of the work that was being done was to help not only the Japanese immigrants who were living in Chinatown, but the Chinese as well, and anybody else who was living in that area. And the Buddhist temple was really at the forefront of that help. And so we know with the beginnings of Japanese Buddhism in Hawaii, I'm sure you've all heard this history, that in 1889, Reverend Kagami, Soryu Kagami, came from Kyushu to Hawaii to help out, because again, you remember the first Japanese immigrants came in 1855, and they came to work the sugar plantations, and they came without their wives and families, and so they were lonely, and they were rebellious, and although they gaman, they held a lot of it inside, they were not happy. They were not happy. The conditions were horrible. And so somebody contacted somebody in Japan, and so the temple sent Reverend Kagahi, and not Kagami, Kagahi, and he came and he tried to work with some of those plantation workers, trying to just, talk to them about not only their spiritual needs, but just their other needs, psychological needs and all of that. And they started to bring in picture brides. They started to allow, women to be near and with the plantation workers. And it was a really difficult time for Buddhism in Japan, because Shinto was considered the state religion at that time, and Buddhism was being suppressed. So it's a very interesting thing that's happening, in Japan. And Kagahi was able to really sort of help the Japanese people. You know what, I'm wrong. It's 1885, not 1855 when they first came. And so in 1889, Honi Satomi came to be the kantoku, which is actually the superintendent of the Buddhist temples, the Buddhist communities here. But people began to call him bishop. And he stayed until the end of 1898, when he went back to Japan. And then in February 1899, when he came back, he brought a young man with him. A very kind of charismatic, energetic guy. And his name was Yamyo Imamura. And Imamura was, as you know, quite an amazing guy. I love this picture of him. Very dapper looking. Okay, so Imamura, sorry, I have to get my notes, was born in Fukuiken in the 1860s. I now have the exact date. Where did I put it? Anyway, do you have it? Yeah. I wrote it down, but I don't remember where I wrote it down. I think it's May of 1860.
May 27th.
I'm sorry.
May 27th.
May 27th.
1867.
1867. And he attended Keio University, but he loved literature. He was really interested in literature. But he decided he was also interested in spirituality and really wanted to put an attention on Buddhism, although Buddhism was having a difficult time at that point. And so he came along with Bishop Satomi in 1899, And, and he worked with Bishop Satomi on the fundraising effort for the new temple on Fort Street, and he was introduced to Mary Foster. And he was told that Mary Foster had given enough money to purchase a 12,500 square foot parcel of land on Fort Street, Fort Lane it was called. So Imamura was put in charge of Waipahu and Aiea and Eva districts on Oahu, sort of the outer reaches, if you will. And he was quite successful in not only, sort of servicing the people in terms of their spiritual needs, but really sort of gathering them together as a community, reminding them of community. And he had such a way about him that people really sort of came to his aid. And when the Chinatown fires occurred, he was one of the first people down there, and he started an association to help the people who had been displaced. So he was doing deep community work. He was doing the real sort of Buddhist work, if you will. The very kind work. So in March of 1899, the bishop was called back to Kyoto. They needed him there. And Imamura became the second bishop, if you will, of Hawaii. And he was the driving force for the next 32 years. So he organized what's called the YMBA, the Young Men's Buddhist Association, based on the YMCA, to create more community, to really get young people not only engaged in Buddhism, but engaged with each other as community. And they needed each other. And it became very, very powerful and very important to the community at that point. And there was a woman named Ellen Barber who helped him set up an English school. And they taught the new wives of these plantation workers and the plantation workers themselves English. And they also taught them other skills, for living in Hawaii and understanding the culture here. And it was really, really important. And Mary Foster became quite good friends with Mrs. Barber. Excuse me. And then Mary Foster and Imamura really started looking at ways that they could collaborate more than just her giving money for the temple. And in 1901, she invited Colonel Olcott, that theosophist with the beard, to Honolulu, and she asked him to give a talk at the new Buddhist temple. So he went, and over 100 people came, and it was in all the newspapers, and they said it was just amazing, and that he knew so much about Buddhism that everyone was very taken with him and very surprised. He was quite a good orator, I understand. So, he talked about, his talk was called Buddhism, the Superior Religion. People really, really took to it. So, and then also in 1901, Imamura and Mary Foster invited the Queen, Liliuokalani, to the Gotanye service at the new temple, and the newspapers around the world noted this, and really sort of opened up people's sort of curiosity about and understanding of Japanese Buddhism in Hawaii. And then the Pacific Commercial Advertiser published a whole series of articles on Japanese Buddhism, particularly Shin Buddhism, in the paper. And so it gave the general community more of an understanding of what the temple was about and what the religion was all about. And it brought a lot of new faces to the temple, not only Japanese. So it was quite something. So, and then in 1901, it was the 729th anniversary of Shinran Shonin's birth. And Mary Foster again was asked to invite the Queen, and she did. And also Augusta Marquez, the man we talked about earlier, he and his wife also attended, and they became very, very good friends with Imamura as well. So Imamura returned to Japan to report on his progress here in Hawaii, and he fell in love. And let's see. Okay. The Okay. Yeah. Okay. All right. So then he fell in love with Kyoko Kai from the Ashikaga clan, and she came to Hawaii to be with him in 1903. And they, in 1904, they had their first son, Kamamo. And in 1904 as well, there was a lot of stuff going on the plantations, if you guys know your history. There were riots because people were really angry about the conditions and the low pay and people getting sick and dying, and so they had a strike. And so the plantation workers, the plantation Luna, the owners, didn't know what to do. So they called Imamura. They said, could you go and help to quell this strike? And he did. He went and he talked to them, and he was successful, but he also was able to talk with the plantation owners about the needs of the workers and to change their minds about how they saw these workers. And then at the same time, he had the Waialua Honganji built to be closer to the needs of the folks out on the plantations. So, okay. So then in 1906, Imamura received the title of Socho, which is the real bishop status according to Kyoto. And the Honpa Honganji was created as a Betsumin. And it became the headquarters of 22 temples and other meeting places that weren't designated as temples, but served to the community by offering classes and teaching and all of that. In 1906, Bishop Imamura applied for a charter that would give the Betsuin a nonprofit status, which would have really helped them in many ways to buy land so that they could do it as a nonprofit. And the governor at the time denied it because he was really fearful. He felt that the temple was teaching Japanese to support Japan and Japanese patriotism. And Imamura tried to convince him, no, we're taking the writings of American, scholars and American statesmen, and we're teaching that to the children, to the families, so that they understand how to be better Americans. And then a woman named Lillian Masick wrote an article about the good works of Imamura, and saying how wonderful it felt when she went to the temple, and what he was doing for the community, not just the Japanese community, but for the entire community. And she talked about the works with the people after the falling of Chinatown. And so then in 1907, the lawyers for the Honganji appealed, and this was a new governor, Governor Freer, and they were able to get that charter of incorporation, and to this day, the Honganji is now a 501c3 nonprofit organization, which gives them a lot of benefits. So, okay. So in 1907, they opened a new school, and the children were really excited about it, and the whole community started to grow and grow and grow, and Imamura realized that he needed to expand, to maybe build a new temple, and so he went to Mary Foster, and he talked to her about helping him. Right then and there, and I'm going to read you the quote. And this is so interesting because there are some people who are not sure that they believe that Mary Foster gave the land. And if she didn't, this is kind of an odd quote from Imamura. So he had to go to Japan to talk about this building of this new temple. And he says, quote, "Upon my return to Hawaii, I went to see Mrs. Mary Foster, a warmly supportive patron in recent years, to explain to her the desire for a new school and possibly temple. She immediately agreed with my idea and on the spot presented me the land for the school. Her graceful figure, raising her arms to say, 'This land is yours,' will always remain in my memory. I have never again felt that height of happiness as when receiving first the encouraging words from the abbot in Japan, and then on the return to Hawaii, the support of Mrs. Foster. The memory of these experiences continues to overwhelm me with warm gratitude on every occasion. The land that was so generously given by Mary Foster was on what was then known as Upper 4th Street. It's now known as the Poly Highway. And the road had not opened then, but it just started to be opened up there. And so that's why you have the division between the school and the temple. And the state was forced to create that tunnel because they had opened that road. And so it's quite amazing. And there was a man who was living in that area. It was all taro patches where the Honganji is now. And there was a Chinese man who was raising taro and had a lot of taro and was quite successful. And when Mary Foster realized, she had allowed him to live there and to do taro farming, she gave him another piece of land comparable or even bigger in another place and allowed him the time to harvest his taro before they would begin the building of the temple. So that was the kind of person she was, So the temple, the money she gave and the land, and I heard this legend, and I don't know if it's true, but I heard that she gave him a bag of gold dust. Anybody ever hear that legend? I don't know where I got it, but I heard that he said she gave him a bag of gold dust to use as he wanted. Because gold is, as it is today, quite important. So all of that land and money went into the building of the school, and they had so much money left over, they were able to build that beautiful, big Honganji temple. So Mary Foster and Bishop Imamura and a local architect got together, and they decided that the temple was going to be something very unique to Hawaii. Does it look like a Japanese temple from Japan? No. Okay, so they took the elements of what's called a Gandharan Indian temple. Gandhara is one of the best architectural and sculptural periods in Buddhist history. And then they took the idea of Shin Buddhism and the idea of how Western churches look, and they incorporated all of those things. That's why you see pews and the way the altar is and certain other things in the temple that are definitely not what you see when you go to Japan. There aren't pews, normally. Some of them now, post-war, they're bringing in pews, but mostly they aren't. So it was their efforts together that created that temple that is there today. And I had heard somewhere that she had some architectural plans from India that she took with them when they went to visit this the architect who ended up building the temple, designing the temple. And but I can't find any record of it, and Honganji doesn't seem to have any record of it as well. So we will never know. So at least not in this life. Okay, so this is the way the temple originally looked in 1918. Okay, the temple opened in July of 1918. Quite different, huh? But still it has that amazing, unique sort of look to it. And they invited all the community, the Haole community, the Chinese community, everybody was invited to the opening of the temple. What do you see? You see a car up there?
He notices a dormitory.
Yeah, the dorm. So that's pretty amazing, huh? That it was, because the school, I think at the beginning was, the students lived in dorms. So, it's there. Okay, so what was her legacy? What was her legacy? I was trying to think of how to really define it, confine it. So number one, I think, is that she brought attention to Buddhism, not just in Hawaii, but to Buddhism everywhere, because of her relationship with Bishop Imamura and her own love of Buddhism, and also her relationship with Anagarika Dharmapala in Sri Lanka. She helped to restore the most sacred place of Buddhism, Bodh Gaya. Now the Bodh Gaya story is quite interesting. So after Dharmapala meets her in Honolulu in 1893, he goes back with money, but he also goes back with this enthusiasm because she's told him that she's going to support his making this happen for the rest of her life. And I can't find any indication that she went there, but I believe she did. And I believe that she went, I found one thing from a woman named Constance Walkmeister, who was a very wealthy woman who sent her a letter in 1894 asking her to join her to go to India. Now, whether Mary Foster went or not, I can't find it. I've gone to see the ship manifests. I can't find any indication that she went, or that she went maybe to California and then across country to New York and went with, I don't know. I just can't find any indication that she really went. But I believe that she did. And I believe that she went from India down to Sri Lanka, which is not a very far distance from India, as you know. And because in all of her correspondence with Dharmapala, she talks about his mother and wanting to know how she is, calls her by name, how's her health, please give my love to her. Now, it's kind of odd if you've never met somebody's mother that you would have that kind of relationship, except that she just adored Dharmapala. And it was not a sexual relationship. She was 20 years older than him, which doesn't mean anything. But I don't think they had that kind of relationship. I think he was pretty much celibate. When I was in Sri Lanka on my Fulbright, I went to meet his family. And his grandniece told me stories about him, that he was kind of an odd guy. He was kind of, forthright and enthusiastic. And she said, I don't think he ever had a relationship with a woman. She said, I just don't. And she said, the reason is, and this is something kind of sad, his mother had a child who died, when she was about 5. And he saw his mother suffer so much from that death. He said, I never want to see another woman suffer in my life. And I don't know why that got translated into not having a relationship, but he never did. He was an anagarika. He was an unordained until later in his life. He became an actual monk towards the end of his life. But he was so consumed with Buddhism and so consumed with helping people. He wasn't a householder at all. In fact, he asked his father to not make him be a householder, to allow him to be an anagarika, a wandering spiritual seeker. And his father was reluctant, because he had a short but very wonderful career in the Department of Education in Sri Lanka. He helped to write new curriculum and was just promoted, but he didn't want that kind of life. He wanted a Buddhist-centered life. Not that he couldn't do it as a householder, a lot of us have done it that way, but he was really dedicated, and especially with the Bodh Gaya project. So he went back to Bodh Gaya, and he lived there for 17 years. 17 years, suit after suit after suit, trying to get the Hindu Mahant to agree to allow Buddhists to come to worship, to be pilgrims in this holiest site of Buddhism. He was really unable to turn anything around. It didn't happen until 1949. Nehru allowed it to become a Buddhist site once again. And the Burmese and the Japanese contributed monetarily, as well as Mary Foster, to the rebuilding of Bodh Gaya. So Dharmapala and Mary Foster didn't live to see Bodh Gaya back in the hands of Buddhists. But in 1951, there was a decree by Nehru. He first approved it in 1949. In 1951, it became a shared sacred site for any pilgrims, spiritual pilgrims, to come to. So the Mahabodhi Society, funded by Mary Foster, did the lion's share of the building, and with contributions from Buddhists all over the world, particularly, again, the Japanese and the Burmese. And then it was really quite something. They created a management committee for the Bodh Gaya temple, made up, this was the final sort of way they appeased the worries of the Hindus. They created a management committee with 3 Buddhist leaders, 3 Hindu leaders, and somebody elected from the local area. So it's a Hindu environment. And the Buddhists who live there don't have voting rights. So always it's a Hindu who gets elected. So that was their kind of way of sort of working it. But still, there's the decisions made about the temple go through this committee and are to this day fair to both Hindus and Buddhists. So it's quite something. And then the Burmese built the first sort of vihara, called a dharamsala or a vihara, and people started to stay there on pilgrimage. And then now, there are probably 32 temples from all over the world. I know some of you have made the trek to Bodh Gaya, covering everything from the Chittagong Hill tribe in Bangladesh to the Korean temples to people from Ladakh, and Japan and China, Korea, every place that you can imagine a Buddhist community being. And it's such, for me, it's like spiritual Disneyland. You know, because the temples are all open. You can go to anybody's temple. It's all free. There's no money. There's no money to go into the grounds of the Mahabodhi temple. It's now been made a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and every year they do a ceremony thanking Mary Foster. So so I was asked to speak at that yearly presentation, and there were thousands of people who had come out to honor Mary Foster and Dharmapala. So it's quite something that she's so well regarded and so well known, and yet here we are, just learning about her now. So what else did she do besides all of that? Again, she helped open the London Buddhist Society, and again it's called the Foster Center. And as I mentioned, a lot of the things in Sri Lanka. She also did a lot here. She did a real lot here. She was friends with the Queen, with Queen Emma, of course, as you know that. And the hospital was opened, and she bought a wing of the entire hospital. They have a big plaque with her name on it to allow people who couldn't afford to stay in the hospital to stay for free. Now she was mostly concerned with Native Hawaiians because they couldn't afford it at all. But she was open to anybody having the opportunity if they couldn't afford it. She also... there. She also bought rooms at Kapiolani Hospital. Now, Kapiolani is an interesting place because her sister had started it as a home for Native Hawaiian women who were having children. And then it became Kapiolani. And she bought rooms, actually an entire floor of rooms for people who couldn't afford to stay. Didn't have her name on it, didn't make it known, but she did it. Her sister Batty, the one who lived in the house that's where the YWCA is on Richard Street, started something called the Kaiulani Home. And of course we know what was happening with leprosy, with Hansen's disease. And a lot of the children they wouldn't allow the children to go with the parents unless they were actively showing Hansen's disease. So they were abandoned. They were, and a lot of the families would not take them in for fear of getting infected. And so they were orphans. And so Batty created the Kaiulani Home that took in the children of these people with Hansen's disease. I worked for the Director of Health in the 70s, and we went over to Kalapaka, where the leprosy, the Hansen's disease colony was. And at that time there were about 120 Hansen's disease patients there. And one of the people who went with us was Mako Araki. I don't know if you knew Mako, lovely guy. And he was the head of the Board of Education. And so we stayed down there for the whole weekend. And we met the patients. And why we were there was because Damien's organ, the plain kind, had ivory keys. And the hunters were stealing the ivory keys. And they're worth a lot of money. And the organ itself was falling apart because of disrepair and nobody really paying attention. So we went over there, we got the Army Corps of Engineers to fly in with a helicopter to bring Damien's organ back here to St. Philomena's. And it was so badly eaten by termites, it fell apart. But while we were there, Mako and I were walking around and we met some of the people, and he had this like ghost-like look on his face. I said, "What's the matter?" We've been friends for a long time. I said, "What's the matter, Mako?" He said, "That guy over there, I went to school with him in Wailua. And when he disappeared from school, nobody knew why." He said, and the family made him change his name. So he had a different name at Kalapapa. The family did not want to be embarrassed for anyone to know that one of their kids was in Kalapapa. And Mako started to cry. He just felt so sad. He said, I always wondered what happened to that guy. And he was just heartbroken. And another woman, Marianne Pune, who used to run the YWCA downtown, really lovely person, lives in Waimea on the Big Island now. She was with me too. When we went down, there was a cave. You know, at the beginning, it was not easy for Hansen's disease patients. They had to swim to shore because it's a very treacherous coast over there. And so some of them were little. My friend Bernard Punakaia, who was the big spokesman for the leprosy, he was 5. He was 5 and he had to swim to shore. So a lot of them drowned. And the ones who made it had to be pretty hardy. So until Damien got there, it was pretty scrappy, and people had a hard time. And a lot of them died not from leprosy, but from just the terror of living there. Anyway, so we go down into this cave. You can walk down, it's all flat land, and there's this cave. We go down there, all of a sudden she and I are getting, chicken skin and getting creeped out. She looks at me, I look at her, we just go out of the cave, and she said, "Whoever lived in that cave did not want us to be there." And I was like, I felt the same thing. So we met the sheriff. He was an amazing guy, Richard Marks. He was the sheriff of Kalapapa. He was a patient, but he was the guy who kept order. And he said to me, "Oh yeah, that woman who lived in that cave, she was treacherous." I said, I felt it. So it was an amazing experience to go there and to see that. And to learn that Mary Foster's sister was doing her part by taking care of the children of these Hansen's disease patients. And Mary Foster supported that home for her entire life. And then she donated scholarships to Kamehameha schools. It had just opened, and they were allowing women, Native Hawaiian women, and she decided she wanted to support their being able to go. So she bought scholarships. I went up to Kamehameha schools and met with the archivist, and she showed me all the papers so I could, prove it to myself and put it in the book, that that's what she did, that she gave scholarships for kids to go to Kamehameha schools. And then, of course, she built that free hospital in Sri Lanka. And beyond the charitable contributions, and there were more, she supported the Salvation Army. She supported all kinds of charitable organizations here and abroad. But really, what more was her legacy? What does her life mean? Why am I interested, and why are you interested in Mary Foster at all? I think because she was a unique woman in an amazing time, first of all. But she was powerful, not because she had money, but because she had spirit, and because she had compassion. And I think she was also able to open up the spaces for different spiritual traditions in Hawaii. What else did she do? I think she gave voice to people who had none, and that she supported causes that weren't popular. Hansen's disease was not a popular thing to be supporting or, even talking about. And I guess I really feel that the compassion that she showed, the care that she had for all kinds of people in need, not just Buddhists, not just Japanese people in Hawaii, people all over. And I don't know how else to articulate beyond that who and what she was. My feeling is, I'm glad she lived. and I'm glad I'm here to tell her story.